Released in 2016 and developed by DICE, Mirror's Edge Catalyst is, like its predecessor, a parkour-based first-person platformer. Though that description feels wrong. Mirror's Edge as a franchise is kind of a genre in and of itself. In some ways, Catalyst is exactly what I, as a Mirror's Edge fan, wanted in a sequel. It's open world, features new levels, and looks better. But it also wasn't at all what I wanted. It doubles down on the story, and it fills its world with pointless collectibles. The relationship between the two games is interesting. DICE opted for calling the second game Catalyst rather than 2, and as that naming implies, it's more of an offshoot than a sequel, despite the fact that it was only the second game in the franchise. It's also unique for a different reason. Even though they feel like they are developed by different studios decades apart, a bit like the original Deus Ex and Human Revolution, they're actually developed by the same studio. Directed by Paddy Liam, Catalyst managed to both stay very loyal to its predecessor and depart radically from it at the same time. If you haven't noticed already, my feelings about Catalyst are mixed, and there will be a lot of criticisms and a lot of praise. I walked away from my first playthrough of Mirror's Edge feeling that the game's formula deserved to be iterated on, and while Catalyst does change things up, it too desperately deserves to be iterated on. My video on Mirror's Edge was the first video I made for the channel, and while it's okay, I've become a lot less bad at writing scripts for these videos since, so hopefully I'll be able to do one of my favorite series justice this time around. I'll also venture a bit out of my comfort zone at the end and pitch my vision for how a potential Mirror's Edge 3 or spiritual successor should look like. Mirror's Edge Catalyst has a 7.4 Metacritic score and a 54 user score, a fair bit below the original Mirror's Edge at 8.0 and 81 respectively. According to How Long to Beat, Mirror's Edge Catalyst is about 8.5 hours long for the story, whereas the original was about 6 hours. My playtimes with both games were much shorter, with Catalyst about 6.5 hours and the original Mirror's Edge at around 2 hours. One of the strange aspects of Catalyst is how it doesn't have a main menu, no save slots, and no time trial for the main missions. Everything is oriented around the open world. Given that the open world really is the core of the game then, let's talk about that first. The original Mirror's Edge was beautiful, and its looks hold up well to this day, but Mirror's Edge Catalyst looks better in almost every way. Running across rooftops in a stunning city is exactly what I wanted from ME2, and the move to an open world makes the game simultaneously more and less replayable for me. I love running around the open world, and when you run a route you know and can keep the flow going without interruptions, the game is just as good as the original. Unfortunately though, the new City of Glass is much more difficult to navigate than the old, and the map is almost worthless, so you end up running into dead ends far too often to reliably hit the flow state. The original had a problem of having too many pipes and air ducts to navigate, and while that problem is greatly reduced in Catalyst, it is replaced by an over-reliance on grappling hooks and an abundance of choke points. Most open worlds force the player to navigate on the ground and clearly indicates where the player can go using roads and trails, but since Catalyst is almost exclusively set on rooftops, it's often difficult to tell where Faith can and can't go, a problem greatly exacerbated by the fact that neither the map screen nor the level design has clear tells for which buildings are part of the level and which are part of the scenery. This isn't a problem if you limit yourself to a single area. It's never hard to tell which of the buildings here can and can't be navigated, for example, but it becomes a huge issue when you need to go from one area to the next. Many areas are blocked off from you at the beginning of the game and only open up when Faith gets the necessary gadget when the player completes a certain story mission. Getting the grappling hook opens up the city a fair bit, and it's one of the more fun ways to get from one area to the next. But one upgrade Faith gets is being able to stop these fans, which you have to do every time you run through this area, and which kills you instantly if you touch the spinning blades. Couple that with the fact that there is often only one direct connection between two areas, one of the most egregious example being that 3 areas, the pier, the regatta, and the village, are only accessible via this ladder.
What a thrill! With darkness and silence through the night, What a thrill.
And it becomes very difficult to navigate on a macro scale, even as navigation on a micro scale is effortless. The city is designed as a series of playgrounds connected by corridors, and it's specifically the fact that DICE is so good at hiding this that makes the world so frustrating to navigate. The best way to make your way from one end of the City of Glass to the other is to use runner's vision, but that comes with issues and annoyances too, as we'll get to later. In short, as much as DICE gave me what I wanted with an open world Mirror's Edge, the execution and world design leaves a lot to be desired. Another of the problems with the open world is the collectibles and side missions. Most of the collectibles are these computer chips which require a slow animation to gather and requires coming to a complete stop in a game built on the idea of momentum. Imagine if you had to come to a complete stop and see a 4-second animation to grab a star coin in Mario. Having collectibles isn't a bad idea, and some of them really do work in MEC, but a lot of them are just not suited to its gameplay. It makes me think that DICE decided to make an open world game based on Mirror's Edge rather than a Mirror's Edge with an open world, in the sense that Catalyst is built like a Ubisoft style open world, which is kind of a genre in and of itself, rather than using the level design principle of building a large open space for the player to traverse. The other collectibles like the grid leaks are actually fun to find, and the climbing puzzles to find the billboard hacks are also great. So the collectibles aren't all bad, it's just that going from 3 per level in Mirror's Edge to like 100 per area in the open world makes finding collectibles feel less like finding a secret and more like checking off a to-do list. The side quests are alright, especially the dashes which actually test your skill and pathfinding abilities, but most of them aren't exceptional. Most are time trials or combat challenges. My biggest gripe with the open world, and with the game overall, is perhaps the most subjective, but it's also wide-ranging and colors the entire game: the aesthetic. Taking Faith from a city which seemed modeled on real-life counterparts to a clearly cyberpunk setting seems innocuous enough on the surface, but it was a pretty big contributor to me not enjoying Catalyst as much as the original. See, Mirror's Edge, like most games, is at its core a power fantasy. The most straightforward power fantasy is something like Call of Duty, where the player character in the campaign is the world's most dangerous man who can single-handedly change the direction of a major war. But power fantasies need not be based in brute strength or violence. The core fantasy Mirror's Edge delivers is being a parkour expert, someone who is skilled, brave, and agile enough to make death-defying jumps across rooftops. The mundane setting of the first game is what makes the fantasy so potent. I haven't been to this office building or mall, but I've been to similar enough places. But I've never been to a cyberpunk city where buildings seem to ignore all laws of physics and practicality, so doing parkour in these spaces become more removed from reality than it was in the original. If you've watched any given Storer video, you know that the original Mirror's Edge stunts are only slightly exaggerated, and I treasured this grounded feeling in the first game. The new City of Glass is not just less grounded by not featuring real staples of city life like offices, metro stations, and malls. It's also less grounded in a more literal sense. It's almost exclusively set on rooftops. Still, these roofs are remarkably well decorated. The architects of the City of Glass have a strange obsession with rooftop water features, and there are a lot of people just standing around on the roof for some reason. Then there's also the problem that when the game actually tries to feature maintenance areas and building sites, they look nothing like you would expect. The game's art direction feels kind of insecure.
Isn't the player gonna be bored if the ladder doesn't have RGB?
Not my favorite aspect of the game, clearly. Luckily, Faith hasn't changed nearly as much as the city around her. The key to making a game like Mirror's Edge work at all was making the movement feel good. If Faith would have been awkward to control, all the level design in the world couldn't have saved the game. Obviously, controlling Faith in the original felt great, and that is still the case in Catalyst. Movement feels great, and on the surface hasn't changed since the first game, with the exception that some of Faith's basic moves are locked behind a skill tree. I still can't fathom how this was shipped in the final product. I mean, how can you release a Mirror's Edge game and decide that the role should be locked by default? Good skill trees give the player new abilities which feel like perks and change how you play the game. A good example of this are some of the perks in Fallout 4, like Blitz. An OK skill tree gives the player useful but mundane bonuses like damage bonuses with a specific weapon type in Cyberpunk 2077. And really bad skill trees chop up the abilities the player should have had access to all along to sell them back to the player one level at a time. Needless to say, Mirror's Edge shouldn't have had a skill tree. It doesn't fit the type of game Emmy wants to be, and the specific implementation here is simply atrocious. It's bad enough that I don't have access to Fate's moves from the start, but it's completely insane to lock some moves behind a mission gate. Amusingly though, the skill tree and leveling system kind of undermines the collectibles, as each collectible give around 10 XP compared to the 750 XP you get from a story mission. The skill tree is not only frustrating for players, it also limits the alternatives for game designers. Because this move here is locked behind a perk wall and thus can't be assumed to be available to all players, it's, as far as I recall, not required once in the entire game, which makes the level design less interesting, the skill ceiling lower, and makes unlocking the damn move pointless. I just can't stress enough how bad an idea it was to include a skill tree in a parkour game. Catalyst is also more generous than the original Mirror's Edge with its timings and where the player faces when wall running, and quick turning in mid-air no longer causes Faith to fall on her back. Faith can't fall when balancing, and Faith can now do a backwards roll. A lot of these sort of small changes are made to the movement. Nothing a casual fan would notice, but it does make Catalyst slightly more forgiving than Mirror's Edge, for good and for bad. Being more accessible is always a good thing, but given that the original Mirror's Edge was hardly hardcore, I don't really see the point of making these changes. The more disappointing aspect of Faith's moveset is the lack of changes. She gets almost no new moves except the double wall run / wall climb, and the grappling hook, which, unlike all the other moves, feels very limiting. The grappling hook can only be used at set points, and you just press a button to swing and press again to jump off. There's also quality of life moves like the backwards roll and right clicking on PC to get sort of a acceleration boost at the beginning to get up to speed faster. And while those changes are good, it's a shame it's not a real expansion of abilities, just simple quality of life stuff. I've been quite negative so far, but I have to be very clear that the movement in Catalyst feels incredible. The sound design and animations make it feel like you control a person, not just a camera with the arms. And unlike games like Red Dead Redemption 2, the great animations don't take away player freedom or make movement sluggish. The Mirror's Edge series would be terrible if DICE didn't get the movement right, but they really did get it right. And despite my issues with the game, Catalyst is very fun to play precisely because of how great it feels to control Faith. It's a shame the open world and levels can't match that quality. Let's discuss the level design in Catalyst, and when I say level design, I refer to the story missions which are set outside the open world, what was the meat of the original. Disappointingly, they feature less parkour than the original, and a lot more hand-to-hand fighting. They're also much more difficult to navigate, and I think a large part of that comes down to the art direction. The new City of Glass is chock full of office building with 100-meter chasms in the middle, RGB lighting, and, fittingly, glass. All the levels in Catalyst are beautiful, but the aforementioned change in aesthetic works to make both levels less mechanically legible and less grounded. And by mechanically legible, I mean that it's hard to distinguish between parts of the obstacle course and the set dressing, which is a much bigger issue here than it was in the previous game. The result of this is to make the player more reliant on runner vision, but the implementation of runner vision is a lot weaker in Catalyst than in the original. Partly that's due to having larger, more open levels and the open world, but it's that shift in scope which makes runner vision more necessary that creates a negative feedback loop. The first game's levels were linear enough so that you could find your way through most of them without much issue, and when you had runner vision turned on, the levels were linear enough that simply highlighting a specific object was enough of a clue to get you to understand where to go next, even at speed. That's no longer the case. The game often needs to show you a red spectre to guide you where to go in the open world, as there can be longish stretches of running without any jumping, Worse still is the fact that this overbearing direction is inconsistent. Sometimes you don't get the directions you need. There's also the aggravating detail that the game will give you full hints in certain levels, even when you have fully turned off runner vision. I get that this might not be a big deal to most, and can even help with the less intuitively designed levels, but it feels patronizing hours into the game when I've gone out of my way to turn off hints. In short, both the level design and the UI is bad at showing you where to go, and even when you know where to go, the climbing challenges are easier and more spectacle driven than in the first game. To sum up this point, let's use the final level of the game as an example. Just like in the original, the climax of Mirror's Edge Catalyst is climbing to the top of the Shard, the tallest building in the City of Glass. The problem is that almost all the climbing you do is on pipes or using your grappling hook. The Shard is supposed to be the narrative and mechanical climax of the game, but it's one of the least interactive main missions, and probably the mission which requires the least amount of real parkour, relying instead on the grappling hook and on combat. The combat is at least an improvement to the previous Mirror's Edge. Removing guns entirely would have been enough to substantially improve it, but it also makes it a bit more interesting by having several different types of enemies and a couple of new combat moves for Faith. The main change is having light and heavy attacks, and the light attacks can be used in motion. A great concept, and those few times when the level design and enemy placement set up opportunities to attack guards at full speed, it works well. Most of the fighting I did though was fighting I had to do. The game sometimes forces you into an arena where it sets up a fight with a bunch of security guards, and those are some of the worst sections of the game for me. See, in normal play, DICE made a system where if you're running at full speed, enemies' bullets cannot hit you, which makes running away from them cooler and easier. But the momentum shield, as that mechanic is called, doesn't work when you have limited space to run. In addition, the most powerful moves Faith has access to are jumping or wall running heavy attacks, which deal significantly more damage than regular heavy attacks. It feels to me as though the health of enemies is balanced on the assumption that you will be using such powerful moves, which makes the more confined and barren arenas real slogs to fight through. I also wonder why the decision was made not to include guns for Faith. Don't get me wrong, it was absolutely the right call, but if it was to make Faith a less violent character, I'm not sure they succeeded. You can freely kick as many K-Sec guards off of skyscrapers as you want to, and the game never acknowledges the Faith is a killer. That being said, the game's narrative staunchly refuses to acknowledge a lot of dumb stuff, so that should hardly be surprising. In short then, the combat is better, but still not good. And the final boss, or at least final encounter against two high-level enemies in the Shard, is an absolutely horrible encounter for me. I didn't invest much into the combat perks, and it made them super tanky. And I mean, look at this room. Where am I gonna run around and jump and do like parkour martial art moves? It's still not good, but whatever. Speaking of still not good, let's talk story. Even as Catalyst makes a lot of changes from its predecessor, it keeps some important traditions alive, like being set in the City of Glass, revolving around Faith and her sister, having its finale at the top of the Shard, and having a generally uninteresting story. The main issue with Catalyst's plot is that it goes too big. It also has very shallow characterization for most characters, and a sort of low-budget sci-fi series feel. Faith isn't just a runner who's trying to save her sister from being framed anymore, she's saving the entire city from losing free thought. Yeah, really. There's also a bit where Faith is working with a terrorist organization, but she disagrees with their methods, and their stern leader questions if Faith has the stomach for the killing required for a revolution. She canonically doesn't, never mind the fact that she could be routinely kicking K-Sec guards off rooftops depending on the player's choices. This is what I mean by saying that it's shallow. It's full of these types of stock characters like the quirky hacker girl and the rival who eventually becomes your friend, and the freedom fighter who wants to accomplish the same goal as our hero, but whose methods always are too violent. There's also a subplot about Faith and Kate, she's called Isabel in this one, finding out that they're sisters. Isabel was kidnapped by the villain Gabriel Kruger as a child. Can't have shit in Detroit, I guess. And no one seems to see the resemblance and put two and two together until the end of the game. I could summarize the plot and explain why most sections and plot beats are underdeveloped, but I don't really see the point. Mirror's Edge is a mechanics-based series, and it remains so. For a deeper dive on the story, I recommend that Boy Aqua's video on the game. Links in the description. The story feels like the afterthought I think it was. It feels like a Netflix original sci-fi series that never got a season 2, and the Fallout 4 Institute vibe some of the locations have going on really don't help. It even features the obligatory sequel bait that won't be followed up on. As mentioned at the top of the video, I have some suggestions for a direction if there's ever a Mirror's Edge 3 or for a spiritual successor. I think a consistent pitfall for the series has been it understanding itself to be action games. By freeing itself from that framing, I think the pacing in the game's levels would improve. Getting rid of fights would free up more resources to making better obstacle courses. I mean, it's not like combat is the only or even main challenge of the game. Instead, I think Mirror's Edge should see itself more as a racing game, or better yet, a sports game in the spirit of Tony Hawk's and especially SSX. There has always been a strange disconnect between narrative and gameplay in Mirror's Edge, in the sense that, for the player, running the obstacle courses is the point of the game, but for Faith, that's just travel between the important story points. Framing the parkour challenges in terms of a competition where Faith has to prove that she can manage a predetermined route makes for a decent way to explain why Faith does a specific run, while also making sure that the player and the character's motivations line up. Early noughties street sport games like Tony Hawk's and SSX not only feel like aesthetically related to Mirror's Edge, in that snowboarding, skateboarding, and parkour all feel sort of X-gamesy, but examining how those games tackle their subject matter could provide more mechanical depth to future parkour games. As mentioned previously, I found it disappointing that Fate's parkour moveset wasn't expanded while her combat moves were. You might say,
but there aren't many parkour moves to add. Faith can already jump, climb, and wall run. What more could you possibly want?
Again, I think the answer is looking to SSX and Tony Hawk's, in this case SSX 3 specifically. SSX 3, for those of you who are unfortunate enough not to have played that absolute banger, is a snowboarding game which is focused on both racing and freestyle, or in plain English, doing tricks. By introducing tricks, there's a new axis for skilled play, as well as a new objective to design levels around, and it brings the variety that combat has traditionally been used to inject in the series. SSX3 is also a great template for an open world game, as the fact that snowboarding is necessarily downhill forces the level and world design to be a bit unconventional. The world in SSX3 is made up of 3 peaks, which each has a number of levels, a mix between race, freestyle, and off-piste levels, which all interconnect into the final level of the game, which also serves as the hub world, the all-peak jam, where the player is tasked to get through the entire 3 peaks from the highest peak to the lowest valley in a huge level, either to beat a freestyle score limit or a race time limit. This design of a semi-open world where there is only one very long path with occasional branches that either rejoin the main branch or leads to dead ends makes it possible to construct a varied world that only needs to be optimized for one direction of travel, which could potentially bring back the quality of linear levels from the first game while still providing the larger scale of the second. In contrast to SSX though, I think the ideal Mirror's Edge semi-open world would be all about ascending rather than descending. I would probably split it into 3 areas, starting off with a residential area with relatively low-rise buildings, which would conclude with a mall level that leads into the second area, which would be industrial mid-rise levels, concluding with a storm drain that takes the player onto the city center with offices and high-rise buildings, concluding with climbing to the top of the shard. Catalyst made it clear that Mirror's Edge works best with linear level, and that combat will always be less interesting than parkour. So, the natural inspiration for a future installment shouldn't be the standard AAA fare of shooters and open worlds with RPG elements. My suggestions here are admittedly crude and coming from someone without any knowledge or experience of game design, and should thus be taken with a pinch of salt. But I firmly believe that my main point, that Mirror's Edge and games like it should think of themselves as racing or sports games rather than as action or adventure games, is solid. If a parkour game is ever to hit the mainstream, I think this change in perspective will be required. Speaking about perspectives, let's talk a bit about the discussion of Mirror's Edge Catalyst here on YouTube. All the people I've seen discuss the game agree on some basic points. Number 1, the skill tree sucks. Number 2, the story sucks. Number 3, the collectibles suck. Number 4, the city is difficult to navigate. And number 5, I still liked it. It really speaks to the strength of the movement mechanics in Mirror's Edge Catalyst that it still works despite all of this. I think White Light said it best. I can't think of anything else that made so many bad choices in such a small package, but I like it and I'd play it again. Racevic, IGN, Double Tap Gaming, Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit, White Light, and That Boy Aqua. Every video I watched to prepare for the YouTube discussion section agreed on this point. The game has lots of flaws, but it's still good. And that's what makes me strongly believe that we're 1 or 2 Mirror's Edge games away from being forced to coin a new terrible genre name like Edge-like or Edging game. No, definitely not that. But you know what I mean. Sooner or later, if they keep iterating, they're gonna make a massive hit. Catalyst, in spite of all its many failings, is still great fun to play. And if it managed to be a good game, rather than a mediocre game with a great central mechanic, it could be a masterpiece. In a way, I feel that I have very little to add to the discussion on Mirror's Edge Catalyst. I agree with everyone else on pretty much every point. I have some novel ideas for where to take the series next, if indeed there ever is another ME game. And I haven't seen anyone else mention my specific nitpicks about making moves more forgiving. And I'm a bit harsher on the story levels than others, but all of this is small stuff. There's a strong consensus view of what Catalyst got right, i.e. movement and faith in first person, and a strong consensus view of what it got wrong, i.e. most other things. I have no hot takes or contrarian views to offer, but I still think Catalyst is worth talking about. After all, the discussion surrounding the cult classic Mirror's Edge is what managed to get it a requel in the first place. Perhaps if we contribute to keeping the discussion going, DICE will be able to get another go at it. And with a bit of luck, I think third time could be the charm. As I've repeated in this video, I've been hard on Catalyst, but it's a good game at its core. There's a particular kind of harshness fans are prone to when a highly anticipated follow-up underdelivers, and while I played Catalyst years after it was released and knew that it was neither an unmitigated disaster nor a flawless masterpiece, I still had high hopes which the game was unable to meet. After replaying the game for this essay, I realized that one of my main gripes with it is how it feels like a reboot of a cult classic by a new studio, even though it was actually DICE that made both Catalyst and the original, and in a relatively short time frame as well. Characters and locations from the original game are reused in new forms, but rather than feeling fresh, they feel like a Marvel-style winking at the audience.
That's the shard, get it?
It's frankly weird how many of Mirror's Edge set pieces return for the sequel. Hanging from a helicopter, dodging signs on the top of a moving train, being chased by a helicopter, running on construction cranes, and climbing the shard in the final mission. It's all so familiar, it's all still there, but it's also cheaper than in the original. The reused set pieces are shorter and less interactive, and the new set pieces DICE obviously spent the most effort on are less fun than the counterparts were in the original. As mentioned, the shard is the ultimate expression of this. It's larger and flashier, with a stranger design than the original, with more hand-to-hand combat, a weaker level design, less interactive set pieces, and inverted reenactment of saving your sister. Just like the naming suggests, a spin-off rather than a sequel, the game itself is more of a remix of elements from the first game than a building upon the foundation Mirror's Edge laid. Ultimately then, I think the reason I have such mixed feelings about Catalyst is that I wanted Mirror's Edge 2, and DICE gave us Mirror's Edge 1.5. Join me next time when we trade the Cyberpunk City of Glass for one of the main influences for the Cyberpunk City aesthetics, Hong Kong. Don't worry, we'll return to Cyberpunk soon enough, but first we'll tackle a different genre, both in terms of story and in terms of gameplay. We'll meet cops and robbers, face questions of identity, beat up goons, and beat up goons in a game with a lot fewer dogs than you might expect.